Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor John Vicofus has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a session entitled "Liberals Legitimizing the Far Right: Class Warfare and Militarism." In the Western world, it is very common to maintain that the far right and authoritarianism is the domain of the axis of evil countries, namely China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, as well as countries like Venezuela, um, Cuba, global South countries, and the axis of evil, basically. The question, of course, that has concerned a number of scholars and even some independent journalists in the last 20 years or so, during the era of the neoliberal political economy, is whether the Western world, including the United States as the core country in the capitalist world system, all operating under the ideological and philosophical umbrella of the legacy of liberalism from the 18th century to the present, have drifted to the right, to embrace aspects of authoritarianism, largely because, especially, let me say this, largely because of militarism, embracing militarism and class warfare, especially under the neoliberal model of the last 45, 50 years or so. Let me first explain liberalism. The father of liberalism, Western liberalism, of course, was John Locke in the late 18th century. John Locke was a philosopher, the philosopher who introduced liberalism to the West. Liberalism is not to be confused with democracy. John Locke did not argue in favor of democracy. He argued in favor of individual rights. He argued in favor of private property. He argued in favor of equality under the law. However, the laws in 18th century England, he maintained, must be made by the parliament, and in order to be, of course, elected to parliament, one at the time, one could not be just someone from the working class, or a peasant, or from the lower echelons of society. It would have to be someone from the middle class. So liberalism really was established as a philosophy, as a political philosophy, to reflect the rising middle class. So liberalism is a middle class philosophy. It's not a philosophy that embraces social democracy to reflect the interests of the working class, um, as property rights, individual rights, rather than the collective class rights, are not considered here. Now, the question, of course, is whether the Western world, especially in the last, like I said, 45 years under neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is not to be confused with liberalism. Neoliberalism is a political economy that advocates the supremacy of the markets over, not just over the state, over society, and the subordination of the state and the collective interest of society to capital, with the support of the state, with the support of the state. So the fact is that the neoliberal model, which liberals and conservatives alike, as well as authoritarians, populist, far right wingers, have embraced, necessarily contradicts and undermines liberalism. Uh, Hence, the genesis of the drifting of liberals into the camp where they have embraced authoritarian policies. Now, I'm addressing this issue because of the recent election of Donald Trump in the United States for his second term in office, but not just because of that, also because there is a larger issue. And it has been around even before Trump won the first time in 2016. And now, of course, in 2024, he won again. And he brought the traditional conservative Republican Party into the far right camp, which is now well entrenched there. And it is a reflection of American mainstream, considering that he has really won twice. And the idea that the far right is an aberration, it's somehow a deviation from the liberal mainstream, is nonsense, because there are two elections that prove otherwise. And the institutional structure under the current administration, I shouldn't say previous, under Biden, in other words, Joe Biden, who claims to be a liberal, and of course he's with the Democratic Party, as well as the entire Democratic establishment, with the exception of the progressive wing, has embraced many of the agendas of the far right with regard to class warfare and militarism, which accounts for the liberal wing of the political arena, legitimizing the far right. So the idea that somehow the only ones are to blame for the drifting of the society, whether it's in France, by the way, where Macron has drifted to the right, closer to the level of neo-fascist Marine Le Pen, the presidential hopeful there, or whether it's in the United States with Kamala Harris against Trump, arguing, well, it's just them. We were different. We're not embracing any of that. That is contradicted by the policies that liberals, whether in France, and I just bring up these two Western countries, whether in France or in the United States, the policies of the self described, self assigned, self baptized liberal wing are not that different. They are at the core, in substance, very similar to those of the populist far right neo fascist opposition. And this is what I want to deal with today. One of the reasons for this is in part because of the decline of the West. During the last 30 years or so, under the neoliberal model, which the West was hoping would account for it's the strengthening, especially in light of the fact that there is no Soviet bloc, the strengthening of the West under the aegis of the United States as the sole superpower, and its defined rule of law world order under itself, as Obama pointed out in 2014. We have to make sure we keep that, and not permit China to determine the rule of law, the terms of trade, and so forth around the world. The decline, the steady decline, when you look at the prospects of the United States, not just in nominal GDP, but also in purchasing power parity GDP today and down the road, no matter who does this, whether it's the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, private institutions like Goldman Sachs, Bloomberg, and so forth, they all reach the same conclusion. The U.S. is headed toward a secondary role in the world system, in the world capitalist system, and there is a transition toward East Asia with China at the core under the Belt and Road Initiative program, which is a global integration, economic integration scheme. So the decline of the West is in part responsible for the liberals, who are as neoliberal as the far right, as the conservatives and the far right that they criticize for having authoritarian, if not neo-fascist tendencies. That decline at the core of this um, merging in policy goals between, and policy, the mechanics of policy as well as the goals of policy, between liberals and the far right, is what has accounted for the legitimacy of the far right and authoritarianism, along with militarism. It has turned out, of course, as we have seen in the last 4 years, in the last 3 years, I should say, both Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, behind which is NATO with the US resolutely pursuing this war to the brink of World War III if necessary. Um, and then, of course, the war in Israel. It's interesting that the war in Israel exposed the hypocrisy of the West as a liberal democratic bloc, while it all along it was accusing the global South, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela. Well, they're the authoritarian. Uh, well, rhetoric aside, there is nothing democratic, nothing liberal about supporting, being complicit in genocide in Israel and not pursuing diplomatic solutions, a diplomatic solution in Ukraine. Nothing democratic about that. Nothing democratic about um, turning around and accusing the International Criminal Court for issuing warrants for the arrest of Israeli top leaders, rather than seeking ceasefire. Nothing democratic and liberal about vetoing repeatedly any resolution to end militarism, which has resulted in genocide with over 44,000 people dead in Gaza, and expanding that war to include Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, as well as Yemen down in the south. So there is nothing, absolutely nothing democratic or liberal about that, especially given the supremacist and racist assumptions behind all of this. Supporting Lebensraum, which is a German term that means um, living space, the Lemersham goals of the Zionist state in Israel, considering it wants to annex Gaza and the West Bank, right? the settlements policy, in other words. Now, let me point out that there is something else here at work that is frightening for a lot of people, and it is under it. It has nothing to do with just the far right, but the liberals also complicit in this, legitimizing the far right, legitimizing the road to authoritarianism, and it's no wonder that the vast majority of the American people believe that their own country is on the path to authoritarianism, with a percentage of them having no problem with it. That's even more frightening, by the way, which gives you an idea of how disillusioned people have been with the liberal status quo and the underlying hypocrisy, considering the liberal status quo has resulted in the continuation of class warfare and the continuation of militarism just as much under liberals as under conservatives. So this is the gist of it. Now, I want to point out that the world is moving much more toward authoritarianism, and international organizations that have kept that do public opinion polls and keep records of what policies what countries are following indicate that more countries in the last 20 years have moved toward embracing authoritarian policies. Um, and they downgrade countries calling themselves democratic, including the United States, by the way, including the United States, yes, because of the violation, not just of international law, like I pointed out with regard to the ICC issuing arrest warrants, and then the US and some of its allies turning around and trying to and accusing the ICC of doing that, and some lawmakers wanting to impose sanctions on the ICC rather than trying to see if they can end the genocide, which is um, the zenith of hypocrisy about how the self assigned Western democracies insist on labeling themselves democratic models that the rest of the world must emulate. And yet, there is this aspect. Let me um, point out what democracy is not. By the way, the word democracy is classical Greek. It means ruled by the people, popular sovereignty, in other words, in essence, popular sovereignty. Democracy, by the way, has never existed. Even in ancient Athens, in 5th century Athens under Pericles, it really was confined to adult male Athenian citizens, no women, no non-Athenians, metics as they were called in classical Greek. No slaves. By the way, Athens had a huge pool of slaves. Um, and within the citizens that had the right to representation in the assembly, those who were educated, and there was no public education, you had to hire a tutor, and that means people of means, they had to have money. um, and the reason for education was, of course, to be well rounded and have ability to think and also speak, and get up in the assembly and propose measures. Really, it was the domain of the wealthy, was the domain of the middle class and the landowners of ancient Athens. Democracy is an ideal concept. In practice, it obviously has never taken place because an elite structure in the social contract existed while the rhetoric about democracy was at the surface. It's no different in our time. There is no such thing as democracy. Although in theory, it's there. Um, there is no doubt that the liberals who claim to have monopoly on democracy have been guilty of a number of things that I want to delineate, and I want to make sure that we were clear what democracy is not. Democracy does not include, by the way, you can't argue that you're a liberal Democrat and then embrace violation of human rights, social justice, and militarism. That's not democracy. Um, Embracing violation of human rights at home or abroad, militarism as a way of life, and denying social justice to one's citizens and circumventing the constitution of a country, of your own constitution, okay, whether it's in France or the United States, which calls for universal rights of free speech, but then in practice suppressing free speech of certain people who criticize policies in the name of national security. Okay, that's not democracy. Or freedom of assembly, and then turning around and arresting people in the name of national security. Okay, so that is not democracy. Democracy also is not institutionalized racism, which the Western world, by the way, going back to the transatlantic slave trade from the 17th century onward to the 19th century, that's not democracy. You can't argue that a country is democratic when it has a slave based economy, as they did until the 19th century, the mid 19th century, from the United States to Brazil, and argue, well, we're democratic. Democratic for what? For the white elites. And you can't be democratic if you are an apartheid state, whether it's South Africa or Israel. South Africans practiced democracy, liberal democracy, for before Nelson Mandela, for the white elite that ruled over 80% of the native population, the African population. There was democracy and liberal democracy pertained to them, but it excluded the indigenous population. So that is not democracy because it is a violation of the Constitution, which calls for universal rights. It is against the principles, the liberal democratic principles of the Enlightenment era, the philosophers who called for universal rights of the Enlightenment era. And on the basis of that philosophy, Western governments adopted constitutions, including the United States. The United States itself, by the way, was created during the Enlightenment era, late 18th century. It is a product of that intellectual revolution called the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. Okay, with Thomas Jefferson, of course, the most famous of those, influenced by John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau um, from that period. One cannot claim that one is embracing the principles of liberal democracy while pursuing policies that undercut this. And that is at the core of what has been happening, not just in the United States, but in Japan, by the way, in South Korea, in Germany, in the UK, in the Western world, which again, I emphasize the Western world, then turns around and says, well, it's actually the Russians. It's the Russians, the Chinese. This is not to say, by the way, that Russia has an oligarchic based system, which the U.S. approved of because it wanted the end of the Soviet Union. So this is what they got. They got Putin, first Yeltsin and now Putin. They had, they got the oligarchic dominated Kremlin under a strong leader, strong meaning dictatorial figurehead who on whose offices depend the oligarchy which owns the means of production in Russia. Um, so this is not to argue that Russia is not authoritarian. This is not to argue that China doesn't have one party system. It does, the Communist Party. This is not to argue that North Korea does not have this hereditary regime. Uh, the fact is that the North Korean is a family operation since the end of World War II. This is from father to son to grandson, an operation that's gone on, and it is an oppressive regime. This is not to say that Iran is not a theocratic society. This is not to deny any of this, okay? However, this doesn't excuse the authoritarian tilt of the Western liberal regimes and that tilt legitimizing the rise of authoritarianism and the conservatives who have moved to the far right while the liberals have moved to the conservative camp, okay? And the trend of authoritarianism all over the world. We have seen leaders from Modi in India today in the last 10 years or so, Jair Bolsonaro before Lula in Brazil, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, Viktor Orban in Hungary. So, yeah, of course, there are all these authoritarian figures in the global south and in the West. Yes, there are. Um, However, leaders who claim to be representatives of liberal democracy have pursued policies that are not that different. Biden and the Western alliance have exposed themselves, especially in the last 4 years. And this is one reason, as Senator Bernie Sanders pointed out after the election in November, when Trump won the election and surprised a lot of people. Um, he pointed, the senator from Vermont pointed out that the Democratic Party abandoned the working class. It did not represent the working class. It represented Wall Street, just like the GOP, which the Democrats accuse of being authoritarian. Some call it neo-fascist and so forth. Be that as it may, the voters did not see their living standards rise. In fact, they saw them decline. Uh, there have been studies that the working class in America and the lower middle class was worse off by the end of the Biden administration than when he took over, by the way. Biden just this year introduced, to give you an idea, just a small sample of this, introduces a 2.5% raise in the Social Security system and the retirement compensation, in other words, on an annualized basis, and then raises by 6% the cost of Medicare. So he takes it back. Takes back whatever, no raise. So, and this is not just, it's not just that example. We have seen, we have seen the rise in the wealth status of the richest 1% of Americans. Let me give you some statistics, by the way, that are frightening on a world scale, not just the United States. I don't want to single out the United States. There are 2,668 billionaires in the world that own 13 trillion. That's about 12% of the world GDP. So 2,668 people own 12% of the world GDP. This is what this kind of socioeconomic polarization has led to political polarization, and people have drifted to the right. Some have drifted to the left, but the majority to the right, seeking solutions from the right because liberals and conservatives alike have been responsible for policies of wealth transfer from the bottom up. Okay. The richest 1% in the world own 42% of the world GDP. This is 8 billion people. Out of 8 billion people, I repeat, 2,668 on 13%. The richest 1% on 42% of the world GDP. When you exclude from the world GDP state-linked um, income, that means that the 99% of the world's population of 8 billion people has less income than the richest 1%. Now, this accounts for alienation of the masses and disillusionment, and they drift to the right and to the left. We had seen this sort of situation during interwar Europe, in Italy especially, and in Germany, but also in across Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, and in Italy and in Germany, of course, with what the result was the rise of fascism in Italy, the rise of the Third Reich, and Nazism in Germany. And the reason is because people become disillusioned with the hypocrisy of the liberal democratic center, so they drift to the right and they drift to the left. Now, this is not necessarily all the working class. A lot of people assume that, oh, it's just the workers going over to the right. Actually, it's the middle class, because we have seen the decline of the middle class because of statistics like these that I just gave you. We have seen the decline of the middle class under the neoliberal model, as well as living standards among the working class. And a society cannot have a viable middle class unless it has a viable working class. And when you see suppressed living standards, you're going to have a problem in society. So the lack of social equilibrium is going to result in the disillusionment. So, going back to the senator from Vermont, Senator Sanders pointed out, the voters, the working class voters, haven't abandoned you. You abandoned them. You lied to them. You promised that you were going to deliver social justice and peace, and you delivered militarism and injustice. So they drifted. They left. They either stayed home or they didn't vote. They either stayed home and didn't vote for Kamala Harris, or they voted for Trump. Okay? So the rise of authoritarianism, as much in America as in other parts of the world, has been not just because of conservatives moving to the far right camp, but of liberals actually embracing authoritarian policies, and under the thin veil of pluralism and diversity, simply appointing, by the way, figureheads a few black people here, a few Muslims there, a few ethnic minorities here and there, um, and saying, well, we accepted them. And all of them coming from very affluent backgrounds, in other words, representing the richest 10% of society rather than the broad population. That's not democracy. Democracy means policies that benefit all of society. Democracy means that social justice and peace are at the core of government policy, of public policy. And when there is an erosion of the social safety net, raising the social security rate age, cutting benefits, refusing to raise the minimum wage, when in fact the minimum wage in many countries around the world, by the way, is well below poverty line. This includes the United States, by the way. Try to live on $15 an hour in New York City or San Francisco. You can't. It's poverty. So this is liberals doing this, not just conservatives, as the liberal Democrats argue. Well, the centrists argue, well, it's them. But then when the liberals come into office, their policies reflect those of big capital and the defense sector. Um, I want to turn to another issue that's been controversial about liberals. It's controversial, actually, period, and especially has attracted in the last 30 years, not just now. Um, but it is beginning to see its to see it sharp. We're beginning to see sharp decline in this, uh, namely identity politics, and how identity politics has become historically, and especially in the last 30 years under neoliberalism, a substitute for democracy. Identity politics is not democracy. It means specific groups, okay, whether it is lifestyle groups or whatever, minority groups, pursuing an agenda, and within that group, actually, the well-to-do, manage to. Their goal is to be integrated into the mainstream stream while leaving the rest behind. Okay, so the class division prevails even within identity politics, because it means nothing to have a minority in the Department of Health and Human Services, for example, if the policy that minority individual pursues doesn't benefit the broad masses of society, it continues to maintain the status quo. So, under the guise of, well, we're in favor of gay rights, for example, okay, what does that do to living standards? What does that do to promote social justice? Fine, you're in favor of tolerance. Tolerance is part of the legacy of the Enlightenment era. It's an Enlightenment ideal to be tolerant in a society. That is a sign that you're not in favor of any authoritarian proclivities, any authoritarian tendencies. But it doesn't address social justice, the broader social justice issues. And it doesn't address the social justice issues across the board at a universal level. Nor does it justify, by the way, transfer of capital from the masses up, because the government is pursuing a policy of corporate subsidies. The US alone spends well over 100 billion a year in corporate subsidies. Some of the largest corporations in the United States, from high-tech companies to retail stores, receive corporate subsidies. Some of the biggest billionaires, the most famous billionaires, by the way, receive corporate subsidies to build a stadium for a sports stadium, while while there is a cut in school lunch programs, for example, a cut in social welfare programs. So this, under liberals as well as conservatives, hence there is a uniparty. There's one party, that of capital, and of course with the support of the police and the military. The other issue, since I alluded to the police, is the issue of reliance on the police state and the military. Liberals have historically presented this image that somehow um, they are in favor of an open society, and a society that does not favor an active uh, police state approach to policy, to public policy, or militarism, when in fact that's not true. The fact is that specifically Biden, for example, as much as Macron, okay, since I mentioned this from the beginning, I'm going to stick with those two, France and the United States. The fact is, France and the US, under centrist regimes, have been just as much in favor of police state methods and militarism as the conservatives and the far right. In some cases, by the way, this is the enigma for a lot of people. In some cases, the far right, the authoritarian far right, which tends to be more isolationist, has been less militaristic, more police state approach methods, but less militaristic. And we see this in the case of Trump, for example, who tries to shy away from militarism. Okay, so the idea that the liberals somehow have nothing to do with legitimizing authoritarianism is nonsense, because the record is different. Biden and Harris, by the way, a former prosecutor in California, Biden and Harris have a record. And the record indicates that they were both in favor of law and order police methods. Okay. Both have a record in terms of supporting the military industrial complex. Both have a record in supporting the war in Ukraine and the genocide in Gaza. You can't run away from that. The same thing with Macron, and again, I'm going to stick with it. The Western world as a whole, by the way. Um, or Scholz in Germany. Let's just put Germany into the equation, because they have been doing the exact same thing. So you can't run away from this reality that the centrist, self-assigned liberal democratic, we're different, not authoritarian, they are. In policies that they pursue, the thin veil of liberal democracy is just that, it's hollow. The policies result in exactly the same thing as those of the far right. And this is why there is voter alienation on a world scale with the far right, and there is polarization in the political arena. The polarization that we see globally, by the way, is the result of this. It's because the center has betrayed the people in terms of what they promise and then what they actually deliver. Um, the liberals have also used, by the way, civil society and NGOs, and have argued, well, that's another sign that we're democratic. We're in favor of, you see, we're grassroots. When in fact, when you look at civil society and NGOs, they have also contributed to maintaining the status quo of preventing social justice from moving forward and preventing peace. Many NGOs are either tied to the state or corporations. Okay. and have been used to further the interests of those, or government policies um, trying to pursue geopolitical goals of destabilizing, as far in terms of NATO, destabilizing regions of the world, whether it's in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, or in South China Sea, Taiwan. So this is another um, level of hypocrisy, using civil society and NGOs and trying to present those who see those are democratic mechanisms. They're not in reality. This is not to say that all of them, by the way, I want to qualify that. This is not to say that all NGOs and civil society organizations are all should all be put in the same basket. But by and large, they have been co-opted. They have been co-opted, just like the green movement, the environmental movement, have been co-opted by big capital and the state under both liberal and conservative elements. So this is another way that the liberals have legitimized the road to authoritarianism. I'm very sorry to say, because, and I'm very sorry to say that I sound pessimistic, but there is very little room for optimism when, in fact, you have a candidate in the United States who was dragged through courts, one court case after another, for all sorts of. There's those of you who are interested, you can Google all sorts of problems that he had, violations of the law, and yet it turns out he got voted into office as president of the United States and brought in as many media organizations in the United States, liberal, of course, point out, brought in individuals themselves in trouble with the law. So we have the lawless elite, political elite, voted into office. Imagine what kind of policies they will pursue. And yet, the liberals are the ones who betrayed the people. Because if they had delivered, as Senator Bernie Sanders said, if they had delivered on the promise of social justice and peace, this would not be happening. So they're the ones who legitimized the far right. They're the ones that the conservatives moved to the far right and are pursuing policies more openly authoritarian. They don't even hide it anymore. They are proud to be authoritarian. That's the amazing thing. This is not, behind the scenes. Oh yeah, we don't want to talk about this. No, they're proud of it. They're proud of it. In fact, they boast about it. It is a badge of honor. It is a badge of honor to be authoritarian, which is amazing in itself. Uh, Let me talk about one last point, because I see we only have a few minutes left. Um, the issue of containment militarism, and how the liberals actually are more military, have been, based on the record, more militaristic um, than the conservatives, in many cases the far right that they accuse of being authoritarian. I believe in 2016 I had read that President Carter uh, advised Trump, I guess, spoke to Trump, and when he uh, was then elected, and he told him that if we look at the history of our country, what we have is, throughout most of our history, we see very few intervals of peace. We have been directly or indirectly at war or destabilizing foreign governments, duly elected in many cases, by the way, duly elected, like in 53 in Iran, overthrowing Mohammad Mossadegh, um, or the government of Guatemala, of Jacobo Arbenz. So the fact is that the U.S. has been, as the great William Appleman Williams, the great historian from the University of Wisconsin, I've mentioned him many times before. Back in the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, he wrote that great book, um, "Empire is a Way of Life." Jimmy Carter, a well-educated man, by the way, um, told Trump the same thing. This is what we are. This is where we are, regardless of whether it is the conservatives or the liberals. Empire as a way of life is the reality. Now, that empire is declining, has been in decline. The zenith of the empire was in 1945, between 45 and 53. In other words, the Truman era. During the Truman era, the US was at the zenith of its power. Why? Because the rest of the world was um, in huge trouble because of World War II. It had declined. Europe destroyed, Japan destroyed, China had a revolution under Mao. So the US enjoyed the zenith of its power. After 53, we begin slowly declining. The IMF, I believe, in 57, 58, maybe it was 59, some late 50s, warned Eisenhower that the balance of payments is a problem. We have chronic deficits. The dollar does not have the intrinsic value that we advertise it has, linked to the gold standard back then. Anyway, the United States steady decline really comes to the forefront in the last 20 years or so, especially after 2008. The Great Recession of 2008 exposed the United States as a core country in the capitalist world system that was losing its dominance in the world as an economic power. And because China bailed it out as well as the world in 2008, a lot of people don't realize this, by the way, by strengthening the state pouring all sorts of money into its own economy to strengthen its economy and then buying bonds, okay, to strengthen the dollar and stimulating economic growth through state mechanisms because China was not pursuing the Washington consensus neoliberal policies. In other words, it was pursuing a mixed model, and it still is, with the state having a very strong role in economic development and looking long term rather than a quarterly report. By the way, they look just like the Japanese. They have long term planning, not quarterly report. Let's see how much profit we can turn out the next 3 months. Not at all. Long term, looking decades ahead. This shift, okay, has driven the United States to become even more militaristic and destabilizing parts of the world to prevent losing Pax Americana, the hegemonic role that it has played since Truman. Containment militarism comes with a price. One price is diversion of money, of funds, badly needed money, from social development and economic development at home to defense, especially when you combine that with pouring a lot of capital, as I pointed, 100 billion, just the federal funds, the state and local pour even more, to corporations, by the way, to attract corporations to coming in, subsidies, tax breaks, and so forth. So corporate subsidies, the corporate welfare state combined with defense expenditures has meant that the liberal Democrats, the so-called non-authoritarians, have been responsible for the rising socioeconomic gap and the disillusionment and alienation of the masses with democracy and liberalism, and driven a segment of them who are desperate. Okay. And by the way, let me just say that just recently I read, in a business journal, an American business journal, how the middle class in America is in steady has been in steady decline and will continue to decline. Okay. And the question is, under whose watch? Both political parties. And when you have the decline of the middle class, you have decline of democracy, and you have the rise of authoritarianism. And this is across the Western world, which turns around and accuses Russia, China, Iran, global South, so forth, of being authoritarian. Well, they have monopoly on authoritarianism. No, they don't. Actually, the West, which instead of denouncing genocide and going along with the international court, criminal court, embracing international law and the United Nations, instead of doing that, they criticize the United Nations and the court. In the name of what? Democracy? So this is where we're at, and I'm afraid this will continue. Trump's election, the first time I remember, was called, and I was arguing this is all wrong. It was called an aberration. It's the exception. It's just, people were tired. There was a minority president, namely Barack Obama, who was as mainstream as you could get. It's just the skin color was darker than the previous presidents, but he was Wall Street and pro-military industrial complex. I don't know, and pro neoliberal. I don't know how else to explain this. When you look at the record of Barack Obama, neoliberal, pro Wall Street, look at all the cabinet appointments, military industrial complex, destabilizing government, regime change operations. By the way, from Libya to Syria. So where exactly what would he was a guy who was advertising himself as a liberal Democrat, progressive, and all that. No, he advanced he advanced the cause of authoritarianism by adopting policies that did not result in greater social justice and peace. Because he himself, when he ran in 2012 for a second term in office, admitted that although America has recovered somewhat from the Great Recession of 2008, the benefits accrue to the richest 1%, not to the middle class and to the workers. So he admitted that his own policies were not rooted in social justice and social democracy, popular democracy, but rather delivered for Wall Street. And then on top of that was pursuing militarism abroad. He was, by the way, very enthusiastic, it turns out, with given some recent publications about his fascination with the CIA and covert operations. That's that's a side issue, but he was very fascinated with that sort of stuff. So what did he do that was different? So what happens in 2016? Trump gets elected. What's the reaction? He's the exception. He's not the rule. He'll never get elected. Never get anything like that again. And yet, since then, the GOP, the Republican Party, which has moved to the far right, by the way, embracing authoritarianism openly, boasting about it, is mainstream. Now it's indisputable that it's mainstream because he just won again It could be an aberration the first time, but the second time, all of this would not have happened if, again, I'll conclude by mentioning my favorite senator, Bernie Sanders. If, as Bernie Sanders said, his own party, the Democratic Party, the party he supports, in other words, would have delivered for the people of America, all the people, not just the richest 1% and not just for the Pentagon, and trying to destabilize governments and regions around the world in order to deliver market share for US corporations and prevent China from the inevitable continued rise to globalism and global ascendancy. I'm afraid for the best we can hope for is Trump coming in and bringing at the very least ceasefire in the Middle East, and of course, an end to the war in Ukraine. But the idea that the mainstream liberals in the Western world, as much in the United States as Western Europe, by the way, or the rest of the world, the idea that liberals are going to deviate from embracing neoliberalism and militarism is not there. There is no evidence. On the contrary, they dig even deeper. They dig their heels and argue, well, in favor of diversity. We're not as harsh on migrants. Okay, somewhat. Um, and the best we can hope for is some peace, at least. But the idea that the neoliberal liberal Democrats are going to deviate from the past 30 years is I just don't see it. So I'm afraid we'll have to end it there. I want to invite you to send in um, comments, to subscribe to this channel. I want to say a word or two. My very good friend Asad Alim devotes a great deal of time and effort to strengthening this educational channel and to provide analysis without any kind of an agenda. And so I would like to invite everyone to join this channel and follow what we do here. Thank you.